Good morning from the Chapel Hill Church of Christ. It's good to have another opportunity to study the Bible with you and to go through God's Word and see how it applies to ourselves. In this lesson, we are going to talk about sacrifice, sacrifices to God. And this is the first of 4 lessons I plan on doing on the topic of sacrifice. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, we are told that we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. The theme of sacrifice is one which is throughout the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. The word sacrifice itself is used something like 280 times in the Scriptures, and the synonym offering is used almost 750 times, which means that taken together, just these 2 words, sacrifices and offerings, are used over 1,000 times in the pages of the Bible. And this doesn't count the other ways in which God tells us to make sacrifices, such as giving or presenting ourselves to Him. The topic of sacrifice is in the New Testament in the person of Jesus. Jesus was our sacrifice for sins. Likewise, as we see in Romans 12, we are to make our lives a living sacrifice. And so sacrifice is very much a part of New Testament doctrine. In the same way, as we go into the Old Testament and we examine the Levitical priesthood, we see that this priesthood was centered around the act of offering sacrifices. In fact, Hebrews 8 and verse 3, every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. This was the job of the priest. The temple of God was built as a place to offer these sacrifices before the throne of God. And the sacrifices of the Old Testament was done to foreshadow the sacrifices of the New Testament. Notice Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 23. It is necessary for the copies of the heavenly things, that is the Old Testament items, to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves, that is the New Testament items, themselves with better sacrifices for these, or than these. Likewise, Hebrews 10 and verse 1, for since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never by the same sacrifices that are continually offered offered every year make perfect those who draw near. So we see a couple things here. First of all, the Old Testament had sacrifices. The New Testament has sacrifices. But the sacrifices of the Old Testament were given as a foreshadowing or as a copy of the true sacrifices of the New Testament. And this is an important concept, a very important idea to understand about the relationship between the Old and the New Testaments. The Old Testament was a shadow, a copy of the reality, which is the New Testament. And as we study the Old Testament sacrifices, we will better understand the sacrifices of the New Testament. Why is it important for us to understand sacrifice, though? And the answer is because if you are a Christian, offering sacrifices is your job. It is the role of the priest to offer gifts and sacrifices. In 1 Peter chapter 1, we find that we are being made, 1 Peter chapter 2, we are being made into a royal priesthood. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. And if we go a little bit earlier in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, we read, you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. This is Jesus. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Again, if you are a Christian, Christ has called you into his priesthood. He is the high priest, but we are a royal and a holy priesthood under Jesus Christ. And as priests, it is our role, our duty, and our obligation to offer spiritual sacrifices to Christ. Now, as we examine the sacrifices that we are to offer, we find that there are at least 3 in the New Testament. And we'll talk more about those towards the end of this lesson. But let's get back to this idea, though, that the Old Testament has sacrifices, and these sacrifices foreshadow the reality or the real things of the New Testament, and we as a holy priesthood are to offer sacrifices. This means that we can learn a lot about our duty to God by examining the Old Testament, and in this case, the sacrifices therein. Let's begin with a question, though. What is a sacrifice? Now, if we look at the origin of the term and the action of sacrifice, we find that a sacrifice was an offering of an animal or a plant or a possession to a divine being. It was frequently done upon an altar of some sort, and as you made your sacrifice, the giving was total. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, if you offered an animal, you offered the animal to God, you killed it, and then you burnt it. The animal was gone. It left your possession and entered into the possession of God through the agency of the priest who offered the sacrifice on your behalf. Again, the animal was killed. It was no longer living. And then it was placed upon a fire on the altar, and it was burnt, sometimes in total, sometimes in part. When it was burned in part, the priest would sometimes take possession of parts of the offering for the good of, or for the sustenance of the priesthood. But again, it left your possession. Likewise, when you offered a plant to God, and there were plant offerings in the Old Testament, you would take the plant and then you would burn it. And when you had burned the plant completely, there was nothing left for you. Sometimes they offered oil. And when they offered oil to God, they would take the oil and then they would pour it out. It would be gone. The offering was total. There were times in which God said that certain items or possessions were to be devoted to him. This could mean a couple of things. It could sometimes mean that those items, those possessions, were to be put in a fire and destroyed, rendering them useless. You were giving it to God. Or sometimes it could mean you took those possessions and you gave them to the priest, and the priest would use them in the service to God. Either way, once the item left your possession, whether it was an animal or a plant or a good, you were not giving it back. To make a sacrifice was to make a total surrender of the thing being sacrificed. As the term kind of evolved, sacrifice could come to mean, or did come to mean, the total surrender of an offering to God. And it was sometimes used of worship or of charity. For instance, in Hebrews 13, verses 15 and 16, we have two of the examples of New Testament sacrifice mentioned there. One is the sacrifice of our lips. This is the total surrender of our adoration to God, where we praise him and give thanks to him. In the very next verse, though, verse 16, Hebrews 13 and verse 16, we have acts of good works, charity towards others. With such sacrifices, the writer says, God is well pleased. Again, you see somebody in need, you give your possession to them, you're not going to get it back. You have sacrificed it in the service of God. When men offered these sacrifices, they were total. It was a complete surrender of that being given. And God expected men to do it in faith. Not as Cain, whose offering displeased God. In our next lesson on acceptable sacrifices, we're going to talk more about this. But in this particular lesson, we mainly want to focus on this idea that sacrifices were an act of giving to God, and giving to God willingly, cheerfully, according to his precepts and commands of the very best. And these sacrifices were, in many cases, a very real loss to the giver, financial loss even. When they gave animals, these were to be the very best animals. These were prize-winning animals they were giving. And they weren't being paid. They weren't selling these animals to God. They were just giving them, and then they would be destroyed. It would be, if we were going to make an analogy to our modern day giving, it would be as if we came to the worship of God and each of us brought a $500, and then we all collectively set our money on fire. That was basically what they were doing with those animals. That's what a sacrifice is. We sometimes make this word less powerful because we use it of things in which where we're not really losing anything. We're not really totally surrendering. We're making a small gift, and sometimes grudgingly. Now, having said all that, though, if we turn to the book of Leviticus, what we find is that as we look through the Old Testament, there were multiple types of sacrifices, and there were multiple occasions for sacrifice. And that's kind of where I want to go with this lesson as we examine the sacrifices of the Old Testament. A lot of times when we think about sacrifice, we think about the sin offering or the guilt offering, and these were two sacrifices that God commanded. But this was not the only time or the only kind of sacrifice that we find in the Old Testament. In fact, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus are devoted to this idea of sacrifice. Now, we're not going to read all 7 chapters, but I'm going to summarize them and summarize the 5 kinds of sacrifices which are found in these chapters. First of all, in Leviticus chapter 1, we have the burnt offering. Now, the burnt offering was the offering of an animal. This was not the same as the sin offering or the guilt offering, both of which were also animal sacrifices. But the burnt offering was a general act of worship. That is, if you wanted to worship God on certain occasions, you would make a burnt offering. You would bring God an animal. The priest would take this animal, he would kill the animal, and then he would place the animal upon the altar, and the fire would consume it. And so the first offering God talks about in Leviticus 1 is the burnt offering, a general sacrifice of worship. The second offering, and we find this one in Leviticus chapter 2, is the grain offering. This is a sacrifice often associated with the harvest, and for obvious reasons. They would bring the first fruits of their grains. They would take this grain, they would render it into flour, and they would make the flour into unleavened bread. And God was very specific in this case. It had to be unleavened bread. There's another type of offering, which we're not going to actually discuss in this lesson, called the wave offering, in which there was leavened bread used. But for the grain offering, it was unleavened bread, and they would take the flour, they would mix it with oil, they would make it into a bread, and then they would put it on the fire, and they would burn it up. And that's the grain offering. In Leviticus chapter 3, we have what is called the peace offering, sometimes also called a fellowship offering. And this one is a little bit unique in that when you made it, you did actually get part of the animal back for your own use. But the peace offering or the fellowship offering was made if you wanted to have a celebratory meal in which God was the focus of the celebration. And you would take an animal and you would bring it to the priest, and the priest again would kill the animal, and then the priest would remove parts of the animal, parts of the innards and the fat, and that portion that portion of the animal would be the offering, and it would be burnt on the fire to God. Portions of the animal then were given back to the one making the offering, and it would be used as a communal meal with those that he had invited to partake with him. Thus the term fellowship offering. It was basically a fellowship meal in which there was a sacrifice involved. Now, that brings us then to the fourth offering, the sin offering, which is discussed in Leviticus chapter 4 and 5. And the sin offering was, again, the offering of an animal, this one specifically for sin. And you would take the animal, you would kill it, and it would be offered to God. There's a fifth offering, though, which is discussed in Leviticus 5 and 6, and this is the guilt offering. And this is an offering that you would make, very similar to the sin offering, but one when you realized you had done wrong, and it was more of a offering of penitence. And so you had the sin offering and the guilt offering. The guilt offering for when you felt guilty over the sins you had committed. The sin offering for more general forgiveness. But 5 different sacrifices. Now, having said there were 5 different sacrifices, it is then important to realize that these sacrifices were used on different occasions. I'm not going to go through all the various passages which talk about the different occasions on which sacrifices were offered or made. But as we read through the Old Testament, and even as we read into the New Testament, we observe many of these occasions. And so I'm just going to enumerate 9 or 10 of them. For instance, when men wanted to worship God, there would be sacrifices of devotion. If you felt like you needed to worship, or if the king felt like the nation needed to worship, they would offer sacrifices. Likewise, God commanded certain feast days during the Old Testament, and on these days of celebration, there would be sacrifices of thanksgiving, and sometimes sin sacrifices, sin offerings, and sometimes grain offerings. But God commanded when they celebrated, they offer sacrifices. And likewise, for other occasions of celebration, there would be opportunities for sacrifice. If a child was born, well, you can offer a sacrifice. If the mother has given birth, she needs to purify herself with a sacrifice. When you have a harvest and you bring in your harvest, that's a time to offer God the first fruits as a sacrifice. If you were seeking God's favor for something, it was reasonable to offer him a sacrifice as you prayed and made entreaties to him. Likewise, when kings went to war, they would offer sacrifices as they prayed to God for victory in battle. And then when they came back from war, they would offer sacrifices in order to celebrate their victory. When men needed to be dedicated to God, to dedicate themselves or to dedicate a place to God, God had them offer sacrifices. When men made a promise to other men and they kept their promise, they would finish out the ritual of the vow, especially with the Nazirite vow, by offering God sacrifices. When men were aware of their sins before God and they felt guilt over those things they had done, they would offer sacrifices. When men were sick and got better, it was appropriate to offer sacrifices to God. And so as we just look at those, and that's just a short list, there's probably other occasions that we could find, but the act of giving to God was not an act which was occasional. It was meant to be an ongoing thing which touched every aspect of the lives of the Israelites. There were sacrifices of dedication, sacrifices of worship, sacrifices of fellowship, sacrifices for celebration, and these would be offered throughout one's lives. And every time you made a sacrifice, you were literally taking something that belonged to you and giving it to God, and it was gone. Now, Obviously, there were sin sacrifices every year. And we often think about those sacrifices for sin as being the primary sacrifice of the Old Testament. But again, that's just not so. If you were happy, offer a sacrifice. If you were sad, offer a sacrifice. If you were guilty, offer a sacrifice. If you had been cleansed, offer a sacrifice. All through the Old Testament, sacrifice was just a part of one's service to God. So, having said that, let's bring it into the New Testament. As we look at the sacrifices of the Old Testament, as we see they foreshadow the sacrifices of the New Testament, of course, we find a direct corollary between the Passover sacrifice and the death of Christ on the cross, a direct corollary between the sin offering and the guilt offering and the death of Christ again on the cross. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 5 teaches us that he was able to do with his sacrifice what the blood of bulls and goats could not do. He offered himself once for all, and now he is seated at the right hand of God. He does not need to die on a yearly basis, and through his blood, men can have the forgiveness of their sins. Having said that, though, that's not the end of sacrifice in the New Testament. We see again, Romans 12:1, make your life a living sacrifice. Give your body as a living sacrifice to God. 1 Peter 2 and verse 5, we are a holy priesthood that we may offer acceptable sacrifices. The sin sacrifice has been done, but sacrifice under the Old Testament points us to a mentality which compels us to continually offer up our goods and our services in the service and the worship of God. Their frequency of sacrifices, the frequency in offering sacrifices, foreshadowed the dedication that we are called to have ourselves. The occasions for their sacrifices, the manifold occasions for their sacrifices, are reminders, is a reminder to us for the frequency and the purpose for which we ourselves should render sacrifice to God, should give to God that which is due him. There's a passage in the scriptures in the Gospel of Matthew which very frequently men use the first part of, neglecting the more important second half of Jesus' saying. Jesus was asked about paying taxes to Caesar, and he has him bring a coin, and it has Caesar's image on it, and Jesus famously said, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And a lot of times we read that and we think there's a separation there between Caesar and God, and we need to pay our taxes. But that's not really the full extent of the message that Jesus is telling us, especially not as we think about the culture and the law under which he lived and the frequency therein of sacrifices and giving to God. Everything is due to God. We must be mindful to render to God his due, to make a sacrifice, to give to him as is proper. We as Christians are being built up as living stones into the temple of God. The temple was the place to offer sacrifices. We are being built up into a holy priesthood. The priesthood were those individuals who offered sacrifices. And again, Peter's quite explicit, so that we ourselves might offer spiritual sacrifices to God. Now, I mentioned previously there are 3 specific sacrifices that the New Testament talks about that we are to make, at least 3. There are probably more that could be added here. I've already mentioned all 3. First of all, we are to offer sacrifices of worship and celebration. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 15, the sacrifices of our lips. We are to do acts of good service to others. Hebrews 13:6. With such sacrifices God is well pleased. And Jesus says in Matthew 25 and verse 40, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. As we give to others, we are giving to God. But those are to be sacrifices. We take that which belongs to us and we give it up. And then Romans chapter 12, in verse 1, our bodies, our lives, all that we are, all that we have, all that we possess is to be given to God. We are to make ourselves a living sacrifice to God, a holy and acceptable act of worship. Now, as we do this, we need to do it examining ourselves. And in our upcoming lessons, we are going to talk more about these three acts of sacrifice, how we should do them, how we should not be doing them, some sacrifices we should not be making. But as we examine ourselves, we must ask ourselves, are we really giving God that which is due him? It is our job to sacrifice to God. And if we're not giving God that which is due him, if we are withholding from him, we are not fulfilling our purpose. We need to be giving him with frequency upon every occasion, every appropriate occasion. We need to be giving him worship and praise and thanksgiving. And if we're withholding that from him, we are doing wrong. We need to be giving to God of our goods, not grudgingly. God loves a cheerful giver. We need to be giving to others, and not giving expecting anything in return, but just taking that which we have, our very best, and giving it to them for their benefit. We need to give God our very best of our lives and give it willingly, because that's what's due him. Are we giving God our best? That's another question to examine in ourselves. Or are we giving him our crumbs, only those things which we don't want? When it comes to worship, are we only worshiping at those times which are convenient, or do we make time to worship God? When we give to others, are we giving them our very best? Are we giving them, our worn out clothes, the food that we ourselves don't enjoy eating, the change in our pockets if we have any left over from buying things for ourselves? Are we giving the best, or are we withholding for ourselves? Are we giving God cheerfully with thanksgiving in our hearts, or are we giving grudgingly? Are we giving God upon every occasion and opportunity, or again, only when the mood strikes us? Are we doing it according to his will, or are we doing it according to our own desires? But again, if we're not offering God those sacrifices which are due him, we are not serving him properly, and we are not fulfilling our purpose and our calling in Christ. I hope that this lesson, just a brief survey of sacrifice and some thoughts about it, has been of interest to you, has been helpful to you in helping you to think about your own service to God and that which is due God. Again, we're going to have 3 more lessons on this topic of sacrifice. I invite you to be on the lookout for those. Until our next time together, though, God bless you, and you have a very good day.